Hi there, I'm Daniel Williams and I'm a professor of English at Swansea University with a particular interest in Wales's connections with the United States. I'm going to talk today about Paul Robeson and his connections with Wales. Who was Robeson? Well, a Renaissance man in the 1920s, an athlete, a singer, a thinker. He emerged during a period that we call today the Harlem Renaissance, a period in the northern part of Manhattan, Harlem, but its effects were felt across the US really, which saw a major efflorescence of African-American art. It was a result in some ways of a growing middle class in the American cities. And Locke described Harlem as the Mecca of the Negro people, playing a role for African Americans, he said, similar to the role that Dublin was playing in Ireland. And the belief of the artists of that period was that American racism could be challenged by the creation of art. They would prove their humanity, if you like, by producing great artworks. And Robeson was very much a part of that, making a name for himself through the concert performances of spirituals, the sorrow songs, as W.E.B. Du Bois called them, performing the spirituals in classical concert kind of dress, accompanied by pianist Lawrence Brown. And through doing that, elevating African-American folk culture, giving it a kind of prestige. In the 1930s, Robeson becomes a well-known socialist. He becomes politically radicalized. He's associated increasingly with the Soviet Union, which isn't really a problem leading into the Second World War, the period of the Popular Front. Robeson is playing Othello on Broadway during the war. To be a kind of fellow traveler, broadly sympathetic to the left and even to Soviet communism wasn't a particular problem, but then it would become a problem after the onset of the Cold War. After the end of the Second World War, the period of the McCarthy witch hunt trials, Robeson becomes a kind of persona non grata. He has his passport confiscated, and pretty much throughout the 1950s, he isn't allowed to travel. He gets his passport back in the late 50s, but through the 60s, the great period of African-American political radicalism, whether the nationalism of Malcolm X or the civil rights of Martin Luther King, Robeson is not a prominent figure, suffering from various forms of ill health, some claiming that he had actually been poisoned by the CIA, and he dies in 1976. So what's the nature of his relationship with Wales? Well, the story goes that he almost impulsively initially joins a group of marching miners in London in the 1920s, a connection then that solidifies during the 1930s. He visits Wales several times. He donates money to Talagarn miners' rest home. He associates with figures in the Welsh Labour movement. He also has connections in Tiger Bay. An uncle of his, Aaron Moselle, from Philadelphia, is living in Tiger Bay during the 30s, and Robeson visits him several times. He then performs the role of David Goliath, an African-American miner in South Wales, in the film Proud Valley, one of the few films that Robeson didn't actually disown later in his life. During the period then of his passport confiscation, there's a movement to give Robeson his passport back, the Let Robeson Sing kind of campaign, and Welsh figures are prominent in that. He's invited to sing at the Miners' Eisteddfod in Porthcawl year after year. He's unable to come, but in '57 he sings via a telephonic link to the pavilion in Porthcawl. And then when he gets his passport back in 1958, he comes to the National Eisteddfod in Ebbw Vale, introduced to the Gymanfagani crowd by Aneurin Bevan, given a Welsh hymn book by the modernist poet T.H. Parry Williams, and retains a connection with Wales, singing with the Cumbach Choir in the early 60s. So there's a period throughout his career where there are significant moments of connection with Wales. In Welsh history, Robeson's connection is something that we like to celebrate. It seems to say something positive, something that we like to think about ourselves, if you like, in Wales. Welsh socialist internationalism is kind of embodied in the figure of Robeson. The idea of Wales as a tolerant nation is embodied in the figure of Robeson. A fairly recent indication of this was in 1999 with the establishment of the Welsh Assembly. That year and the year following saw a major exhibition on Paul Robeson at the National Museum in Cardiff. And then it travelled Wales, a celebration of Robeson's connections with Wales. Manifested also in a song by the Manic Street Preachers in that period. Robeson's connections with Wales have been somewhat mythologized in Welsh history. It reflects something we like to think about ourselves, right? Internationalist, tolerant Wales. With Robeson's connections as an embodiment of that, the meeting between Aneurin Bevan and Robeson on the Eisteddfod stage seems to capture a number of the sort of intellectual strains within Welsh culture. You know, the particularity of the Welsh language tradition, the Gymanfa, but also the socialist internationalism represented by Bevan. Now, my intention today is in some ways to problematize that a little bit, to ask some questions, both about Robeson himself and his role in African-American history, and then about the Wales to which he identified, with which he identified, and who claim him in some ways as an honorary Welshman, according to at least some commentators. So Robeson himself, yeah, he's a socialist. He talks about discovering the internationalist nature of the labour movement in South Wales in his book, Here I Stand. But Robeson was also a nationalist and quite an important black nationalist thinker in the 1930s. His interest in the Soviet Union derived from his belief that the Soviets had answered what he described as the minority nationalities question. And he was taken by Stalin's writings on the national question. He admired the way in which the Welsh had managed to hold on to their language and traditions in the face of the imperial neighbour, if you like. And at Ebu Vale, he talked about singing in the Gymanfa as being similar to certain kind of events of that kind that he'd attended amongst his own people, not least as the son of a minister. So there's a black nationalist dimension to Robeson's thought as well, which I think has something to do with the way in which he responds to not only Wales, but actually many minority peoples, both in Europe and across the world. There's an element of romanticization about that. You know, he said, I couldn't really sing French or German songs, but I can sing the songs of the Irish and the Welsh and the Jews and so forth. It's a kind of rainbow coalition of minorities that he presents in his work. His support for the Soviet Union was fairly unwavering. And in the late 40s, during a visit, he finds that one of his Jewish friends, Solomon Michaels, has been killed, and another friend, Itzhak Pfeffer, is being kept in confinement by Stalin. Robeson meets him, but gets a sense of what is in fact an anti-Jewish pogrom taking place. Robeson protests by singing the Song of the Warsaw Ghetto in Tchaikovsky Hall in Moscow during that visit. There's a famous recording of that. But upon return then to the United States, he denies any knowledge of anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism in the Soviet Union. So there's a dark element to that story. Joseph Svoreki, the Czech author in the bass saxophone, talks about his generation of Czechs seeking a kind of freedom from the iron heel of the Soviet regime and wanting to hear Dizzy Gillespie and Duke Ellington and the modern jazz artists, and having to listen to Robeson instead, and hating him because of that, because the Soviet authorities were pushing him. So Robeson gets caught, if you like, in Cold War politics, and is used by the Soviet Union to actually draw attention to racist atrocities in the US. In fact, when the US State Department started to send jazz musicians to Eastern Europe and Russia from the mid-50s onwards, they're doing so at least partly to counter the presentation that Paul Robeson is giving of the United States as an inherently, if you like, racist country. There's talk then that Robeson was actually profoundly disillusioned following the exposure of Stalinist atrocities in the late 50s, but never dissociated himself from the Soviet Union. And some claim, that his later ill health and disappearance from the public stage was partly a result of his conflicted feelings. So in a sense, he's a figure who gets caught in Cold War politics and in some ways is crushed by them. So Paul Robeson is a more complex figure than the myths perhaps allow. That's true also of the South Walian societies with which he identified and that identified with him, because as well as enjoying performances by Paul Robeson, these societies would also enjoy minstrel shows, blackface minstrelsy, any of those sort of sepia books, Old Rhondda, Old Abertillery, Old Neath, will contain, especially in the 20s and 30s, pictures of carnivals and performances where white individuals blacken their faces, dress up as primitives. And that's part of the context in which Paul Robeson was performing. That is a history of racist lampooning of African-American performers. Now, this has its roots, of course, in 19th century America, and the generation of cultural historians in America have written about minstrelsy. Some particularly looking at the reasons for why it was particularly popular, even in areas without a very significant African-American presence at all. And one of the theories offered by Eric Lott and David Roediger and figures like that is that the minstrel show offered a commentary on what had happened to the white working class in the process of very rapid industrialization that we also see in South Wales. The movement from the country to the city, the rejection of old rural Wales, primitive Wales, for the new urban communities of South Wales. Similar process from the rejection of rural America for urban America, and that rural past being marked as black, if you like. So there's a lampooning of primitivism. And this relates to the whole question, I think, of white privilege that has been discussed in relation to Black Lives Matter today. Because when you look at South Wales, conditions in the coalfields, poverty, children being born with rickets and so forth, it doesn't seem a particularly privileged society. But as W.E.B. Du Bois noted in the 1920s, there are wages that come with whiteness. There's a privilege that comes with whiteness, and that is the ability to be white. An example of this in Wales would be the efforts of the Welsh to whiten themselves very consciously in the 19th century. The Blue Books report, a slanderous report on not just education in Wales, but also the morals of the people and so forth, in 1847, described the Welsh really as black, essentially. Welsh is the language of slavery, the Anglican English writers of that report told us. And that Welsh nonconformist religion, coupled with a language, were holding the Welsh or keeping the Welsh under the hatches. I think an image actually that comes from the slave ship. That is, the language of empire was part of the language of the Blue Books. And the Welsh bourgeoisie responded to that by trying to make themselves less black. Cymru Lan, Cymru Lonydd, Cymru Wen, Cambriano Ilbeinydd is a famous englyn of the 19th century, pure, docile, white whales. And although that whiteness is partly biblical, it also has a kind of racial dimension to it in the context of imperial Britain. So that process by which the Welsh became white, if you like. Noel Ignatieff has a similar story about the Irish in America, how the Irish became white. Well, that's white privilege, right? That was not an option that actual African Americans or people of African descent in Wales and elsewhere, that was not an option for them. Part of the reasons why the blue books were scandalous was because they were describing white people as black. And the legacy of that, is still with us in different ways. Robeson was aware of this, he's continued to sing dear old Southland numbers and Dixie numbers, kind of aware of what a white audience might expect of him. And in the films of the 30s in particular, he was asked to play sort of primitive roles, Twala the King in King Solomon's Mines, for instance. It's one of the things that made him completely disillusioned with film. Although he retained a liking for Proud Valley, but even there's an element of stereotyping that's taking place. We see all this reflected in the literature of the 1930s. The novels of Jack Jones in English and of T. Rowland Hughes in Welsh have a lot of minstrel figures. They're commenting really on the creation of what we might call a white working class in South Wales. Out of the diversity of the Irish, the Spanish, the Jews, the English, Scots in the South Wales valleys, a cohesive identity developed, which had a lot of positives about it. But it seems that part of that process of creating a coherent identity was also to create a black other against which it defined itself. This is, after all, imperial South Wales. The coalfield is developed in the context of empire. And that does have cultural effects on the construction of Welshness and on the reception, I think, of Paul Robeson in the 1930s. So before we bask too much in that international solidarity that Robeson represents, there are also other aspects of Welsh culture that he helps draw our attention to. So what have I been saying? Well, I suppose that the tendency is to bask, if you like, in the glory of the Welsh connection with Robeson. It's a connection he had with many nations. It's not actually that unique. It was part of his attempt, really, to create a kind of international rainbow coalition of the left to fight against racism and imperialism. There's a case for demythologizing elements of that story, both in relation to what Robeson himself represented and thought in his own life, and in relation to the Wales that he identified with and who identified with him. Charlotte Williams, in her wonderful autobiography, Sugar and Slate, talks about Paul Robeson and Proud Valley and describes the film as a civil rights film for Wales. But then asks, if the Welshman is a black man at heart, then what about Welsh people who are black? And the relationship with Robeson raises that. As I said, he had significant connections with Tiger Bay that are worth exploring. But also that we should use his example as both an example of tolerance, but also as a way of discussing some of the racial, imperial, racist attitudes in Welsh culture as well. He's one of those figures who might allow us actually to begin to identify those parts of our culture and our thought that are worth preserving and developing, and those parts of our culture and history that we should acknowledge but reject in the process of developing a hopefully tolerant Wales of the future. Thank you.